Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we'll gently peel back the foggy layers of Victorian London, where simply surviving the day was considered a personal achievement. Forget the noble tea parties or the shimmering palace halls. You're waking up on a straw mat, as stiff as expired biscuits, lying next to almost face to face with your brother's foot twitching because he just dreamed of missing dinner. The room has one bucket. Just one. Used for everything you're thinking of and a few things you haven't thought of yet. No air conditioning, no hot water, and if you dare open the window, you'll get a full inhale of smoke horse manure and the neighbor yelling about their shoes being stolen for the third time this week. And if you think you could survive here honestly, you wouldn't make it past breakfast. So before you settle in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I'm doing here. And I always want to know, where are you watching from and what time is it there? Hopefully not dinner time while I'm talking about the bucket. Now turn off the lights, let the fan hum gently in the background, and let's step into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes. There are no birds chirping, no gentle sunlight streaming through the curtains. Just the sound of someone hacking up a lung in the corner of the room and a smell that's half wet coal, half a burned-out dream. Good morning from Victorian London, where every night's sleep is a minor survival challenge. The blanket on you. A thin piece of wool that once had color, now defined only by its persistent damp smell. Your pillow is a sack of straw. Not the cute kind from countryside paintings. This is the kind of straw that has absorbed years of crumbs, foot traffic, and a few things best left unexamined after dark. You turn your head to the right, hoping to catch a soft sunrise. No, just your brother's foot twitching gently as if he's dreaming of meat soup. The last time anyone in the family had real meat soup was 3 winters ago, and there's still debate over whether the meat was meat or mushroom growth from the old cabbage bucket. Bedroom num. It's the room singular and complete. Living room, dining room, workroom, everything room. 6 people, 1 bed, 2 chairs with collapsing legs, 1 fireplace drawn in chalk on the wall for comfort, and 1 bucket, a quiet but constant supporting character, especially in the mornings when people line up. You think about getting out of bed, but the floorboards sound off like an elderly man betrayed by his joints. Each creak seems to say, "You sure you want to step here, kid?" You step down anyway because, the day has to start sometime. And starting the day here means organizing the rotation around the tiny wash basin. No hot water. Just cold like your 4th grade crush rejection. First person gets clear water. Last person gets a historical gray soup with floating cabbage leaves like leftovers from yesterday. Battle with dinner. Nearby, you hear someone clinking a spoon against a bowl, the signal of something vaguely resembling breakfast. Don't get excited. Breakfast here is a piece of bread that could double as a weapon. Dry, hard, and sharp-edged. If you're lucky, your mother might drizzle some old tea over it, a concoction called luxury soup on festive days. And tea, yes, tea always exists. Not because it tastes good, but because it's boiled. And in Victorian times, boiled meant a 12% increase in survival odds. Milk, maybe. But milk often comes with a game. Guess if this is milk or a health hazard? Chewing the bread like you're reconsidering all your life decisions, you hear a scream from the alley. Some old lady lost her chicken again. Either stolen or the chicken left on its own, fed up with this life. You throw on a coat as thin as your math teacher's patience and prepare to leave. Outside, the fog is so thick you can't tell if you've stepped onto the street or into an unseasoned soup. This isn't that romantic French movie fog. This is purebred London fog, a blend of coal smoke, factory fumes, and everything your lungs beg you to avoid. You take a breath, your lungs protest immediately. A cough escapes echoing through the alley. A kid next door answers with the same cough, like a chorus of disapproving lungs. You weave through the street. Every step is a dodge. This game horse manure, wastewater, mud, and unnameable liquids. Someone's rinsing their hands under roof runoff. Another is cleaning shoes with newspaper. The only thing clean around here is hope. And even that's as thin as that newspaper. You reach the corner where market stalls begin to open. A vendor yells, "Fried potato cakes sounds tempting." But you already know. The oil's from last week. The potatoes are the kind even rats hesitate to chew. But your stomach growls. Even patience has limits. You take a bite. It tastes like hope with a suspicious aftertaste. And that's just the morning. You finish the fried potato cake, or at least the hardest part of it, and move on. The sun hasn't fully risen, but the streets are already crowded. People shoulder to shoulder, the grinding of wheels over uneven cobblestones, shouting, coughing. So much coughing woven together like a symphony composed of dust, hunger, and exhaustion. You dodge a puddle of questionable origin, then nearly get run over by a horse-drawn cart. The driver yells, cursing you in a thick London accent. You respond with a blank stare that says, "I've seen worse in the bucket back home." You're on your way to the factory, not because you love your job, but because not going means eating nothing. Factory sounds orderly, but it's really a dark warehouse full of growling machines and more people than oxygen. Your job is to repeat the same movement for 12 hours straight, every single day. Your hands ache so much that sometimes you dream you've become part of the machine itself. Wages. Enough for a loaf of bread, 2 potatoes, and discounted to spare. Some days the boss doesn't pay at all because of lost orders. Whether they were really lost, only he and God know. Ask about it, and you're met with a glare, like you've insulted the sanctity of the means of production. In the corner, a child struggles to pull their hand from a machine. They're only 8. Hired because small hands fit better. They cry, but the machine doesn't stop. The machine doesn't care. You glance over, but don't help. The rule here is simple. Don't pay too much attention unless you want to be next. You get a 1-minute break. 1 minute. Just enough to take a deep breath and cough out something dark. You can't remember the last time breathing didn't burn your throat. Maybe it was before you learned the word coal. Noon passes like a vague concept. No bells, no real pause. If you brought food, you eat. If you didn't, you watch. Some gnaw on bread as hard as bricks, others sip watery gruel from a dented tin can that resembles the cook's chin. You chew on the memory of breakfast. In the afternoon, the machines roar again like they're growling for more souls. An old man slips and loses 2 fingers. He doesn't cry, just quietly wraps his hand in cloth and sits in the corner, still as broken equipment. No one screams. No one calls a doctor. Doctors are expensive, and fingers aren't necessary for work. As long as the arm is still attached, you're fine. When the shift ends, you don't walk out of the factory, you drag yourself. Feet numb, eyes burning, your mind still echoing with the clatter of machines. But you made it out, which means you're still alive. Which means today you won another round against fate, even if it's a game with no prize. You pass through the damp alley where stray kids are scavenging. One cheers at finding a chicken bone as if it were treasure. Another shows off a rusty nail like a prized artifact. You smile softly, not out of joy, but because it's familiar. Night begins to fall. But in London, night doesn't mean peace. Night means the smell of garbage thickens, the fog settles heavier, and every sound echoes like the city itself is laughing at you. You see a woman wrapped in a blanket holding her child in a corner. The baby sleeps, head resting on her arm, thin and pale as wilted greens. You don't look too long, because if you do, you might see yourself in her. Back home, you open the door. The hinges creak like they too have had a long day. Everyone's gathered around the wash basin, not to wash, but to warm their hands over steam from freshly boiled water. Beside it, a pot of soup called soup, but really just hot water with 3 pieces of cabbage and 1 lonely strand of green onion. You eat. It's not tasty, but it's warm. And sometimes that's enough. A child asks, "Did anything fun happen today?" You look at them and say, "I saw a kid dig up a nail as big as a pinky finger." The room bursts into laughter. Not because it's funny, but because here that really is good news. You lie down on the old straw mat. Your back aches, your hands throb, but your eyes begin to close. Outside, the city still breathes heavily, hoarsely, and full of smoke. But you survived another day. In Victorian London, that counts as a victory. You think about the doctor. Not in the "I should schedule a checkup" kind of way. More like, would the doctor kill me faster than the illness would? In Victorian London, medical care sounded like a comforting phrase until you realized it involved opium saws. And a man in a blood-stained apron telling you to bite down on a piece of wood to ease the pain. First, let's be clear, if you're poor, you don't get a doctor. No health insurance, no NHS. No find a clinic near me app. You just try not to die during peak hours. If you're lucky in the broadest and darkest sense, you get taken to a barber surgeon, meaning someone who cuts hair and legs. Yes, one person, one pair of scissors, one knife, one bucket. Toothache, hell, pull it. Broken arm, hell, snap it back into place. Stomach pain, hell, nod solemnly and hand you a bottle labeled laudanum. Ah yes, laudanum. That's opium mixed with alcohol. In Victorian times, it was the super drug that cured everything. Headaches, stomach aches, insomnia, bad moods, and existence itself. Heartbroken, drink laudanum. Got a 104-degree fever, laudanum. Dying. All the more reason for laudanum, so you don't notice you're dying anymore. Hospitals. If you actually make it to one, congratulations, you've reached the final boss fight of your immune system. There were no masks, no gloves, and definitely no sanitizing. A doctor would perform surgery on one patient, wipe his hands on his coat, then move on to the next. Not out of cruelty, but because the concept of germs wasn't really a thing yet. People believed disease spread through bad air, cold drafts, or simply fate. Some forward-thinking doctors said we should wash our hands before surgery. The typical response: "Are you mad? I'm a doctor, not a cook. If you needed surgery, you'd better have a sturdy piece of wood to bite and someone strong to hold you down." There was no anesthesia, no morphine, just screaming blood and hope the doctor's hand didn't shake that day. There was a case where a doctor was sawing off a leg, but rushed so badly he cut off his assistant's fingers and slashed another patient nearby. Total of 3 deaths. The only surgery in history with a 125% mortality rate. And women. They had their own survival game, childbirth. No painkillers, no personal doctors. And if you died from shock infection or blood loss, the only comfort left was, at least the baby survived. If it did. In maternity hospitals, they noticed maternal deaths dropped significantly when doctors washed their hands after dissecting corpses. The problem, they didn't want to wash. Because a doctor's hands have germs, ridiculous. And as for medicine besides opium and alcohol, you might try things like mercury for gum disease and incidentally liver failure. Lead powder for whiter skin, and possibly whiter, as in corpse pale. Bear fat for shiny hair if you survived applying it. If you were poor and couldn't go to the hospital, you stayed home. Herbal wraps, onion poultices, candlelight, and hope. Lots of hope. People called it natural therapy. But really it was we have no money therapy. Some say people were stronger back then. No, they just had fewer choices. They survived through willpower, immune systems, and because no one gave them sick leave long enough to actually be sick. You lie back on your straw bed, eyes closed, throat sore, a mild fever. You tell yourself it's probably just a cold. Then you remember that in this era, a cold could kill you. You breathe gently and hope at the very least you won't need to see the barber with a knife tonight. You lie there, throat as dry as old parchment, vaguely wondering, should I get up for a drink of water? If you live in Victorian London, the answer is no. Unless you want to lose at the game called Who Gets Infected First. Here, water isn't something you drink to quench thirst. Water is a lottery ticket with the jackpot prize of prolonged diarrhea or a plain wooden coffin. The city's water supply mostly comes from the Thames River, which serves simultaneously as a water treatment facility via letting scum rise to the top, a horse swimming pool, and an unintentional graveyard for everything from old shoes and dead dogs to dreams drowned in cow manure. They said the water was filtered, but filtered here meant it passed through a layer of gravel belief and a few old socks. If you're wondering whether the water is clear, it's not. If you ask what it tastes like, it's best described as kind of like spoiled cabbage soup, but in the color of despair. And if you see the water shimmering by candlelight, don't be hopeful. That's not a sparkle of hope. That's bacteria doing synchronized swimming with pride. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, a whole cast of microbes partying inside your body after one sip of clean water. The solution: drink beer. Not because you want to get drunk, but because beer is boiled during brewing, and in this era, anything boiled is instantly a lifesaver. Children drank beer. Old people drank beer. Anyone alive after 2 winters, they definitely drank lots of weak beer. Mild, warm, and tasted like someone once thought about malt, then changed their mind. And what about bathing? Well, you might want to bathe, but in this time wanting doesn't mean getting. Bathing was a major event. Like a birthday. Regular frequency, about once a month. And if you really stank, people would say you were getting ready for a party. Bathtub number: just a tin basin in the kitchen, shared by the entire family in strict order of age or dominance. The first got clean water. The last experienced a warm soup of human skin. Soap, a luxury. It could be given as a birthday gift. Ingredients: a mix of animal fat, fireplace ash, and a scent vaguely reminiscent of a very old doormat. And if you were a woman, washing your hair was a ceremonial affair requiring at least 2 helpers, a bucket of water, and a quiet prayer. Personal hygiene. Toothbrushes back then looked like mini pot scrubbers. Toothpaste was charcoal powder or some unidentified white substance you were better off not questioning. After brushing your teeth, weren't whiter, just more uniformly dark. Toilets. Sorry, we weren't that advanced yet. You had a few options. The bucket, the legendary item in every household. The alley behind the house only if it was dark and the neighbors were asleep, or just do it in the street like any other civilized person. The government did try to improve things by building public privies. But don't imagine anything grand. They were pits in the ground with a wooden lid, a newspaper nearby, or sometimes nothing at all, and occasionally more than one person inside. In the early mornings, families would carry their buckets to dump them into the drainage channel in the middle of the street. Everything would slither through like a small river of the apocalypse. Children played nearby. Dogs swam across. People tried not to look down. One time someone slipped and fell into the gutter. No one laughed, because everyone knew it could be them next. Worse, many homes had pipes that emptied directly into the Thames River. Yes, the same river you were drinking from. The natural cycle reached its darkest peak. And then one day, when the smell from the Thames was so bad that Parliament had to evacuate the building, they finally decided, maybe we should build a proper sewage system. That was in 1858, which means millions of people had lived for decades drinking contaminated water with no plumbing and bathtubs that were pure fantasy. And now when you pour yourself a glass of clean water, step into a warm shower, use mint toothpaste, and don't have to share a bucket with your whole family, you survived without living in the Victorian era. You cough. Just a little, but in Victorian London, no cough is ever just a little. It's the overture to a possible tragedy. Dry cough might be dust. Phlegmy cough might be coal. Coughing blood. Welcome to the Consumption Club. Consumption sounds poetic, but it was the old name for tuberculosis. And in Victorian times, it wasn't just a disease, it was a quiet companion shadowing you like a very patient tax collector. It made you waste away, coughing endlessly, until you started coughing up blood. The terrifying part was that it didn't kill you quickly. It eroded you bit by bit, artistically. People once called it the romantic death, because you looked like a heartbroken poet, pale, hollow-eyed, faded lips, except you no longer had the strength to write poetry. And instead of dying in your lover's arms, you died in a moldy room next to a bucket and the matching cough from someone downstairs. If it wasn't TB, then maybe cholera. A disease less patient than tuberculosis, it liked to strike fast. You'd be fine in the morning, and by evening you were curled up, stomach-twisted diarrhea, dehydration, and deep regret over that clean-looking water. Cholera killed in hours sometimes, while you sat on the bucket shaking, parched, then still. Signs cholera was approaching. First, the streets went quiet. Not because everyone was out, but because the whole neighborhood was in bed, too afraid to move. And if you heard the chains clinking as people dumped dirty water into the gutter, that was the only sound of life. A kind of hope flowing alongside waste. Usually the authorities would shut off the public water pump after half the neighborhood had collapsed. Yes, rapid response wasn't this era's strong suit. And survivors would keep coughing, blaming it on bad air. No one suspected bacteria. Bacteria hadn't made a name for itself yet. Then there was typhoid. A combo of high fever, delirium, diarrhea, and hallucinations. You might dream of riding a horse and wake up in a trough beside a goat. And don't forget smallpox. Think pimples are a problem. Imagine your entire body covered in red, pus-filled blisters, a raging fever, blurred vision, and lifelong scars. If you survived. Vaccination, yes. But back then it meant cutting your skin, scraping pus from someone already infected and rubbing it into your wound. Known as transferring immunity through sheer trust. If that sounds suspicious, it was. Very. You were sick, but doctors often didn't know what was wrong. So they'd try a bunch of things. Bloodletting because your blood might be too full. Mustard plasters on your back as if your body were a sandwich that needed waking up. Stomach rubbing, cupping, herbal steamings. And finally, let's rest him and prepare for the worst. And when a major outbreak hit like the Great Plague, households with illness were marked with red paint. Healthy ones hung charms, lit incense, and changed addresses if possible. In the city, epidemics were an annual affair. Like monsoon season, sometimes they killed a few, sometimes a whole district, and sometimes you. And now you're lying there in a warm room, with clean water paracetamol on the shelf and a doctor just one phone call away. If you cough, you can say, "It's probably just allergies," instead of "I should probably write my will." Congratulations. You survived not just disease, but an era where a poorly timed sneeze could get you buried the same day. You step outside, eyes still stinging from the kitchen smoke, stomach empty, and your mood just as bleak as the weather. But it's okay, you just need to cross the street ahead. Just one street. Easy, right, wrong. Traffic in Victorian London was unlike anything you've ever known. No traffic lights, no road markings, and definitely no yielding unless you were a horse. The streets were always filled with horse-drawn carriages, pedestrians, coal carts, rubbish wagons, stray dogs, and sometimes a few unclaimed watermelons. Every 10 steps you had to dodge a wheel or a screaming child who'd lost a shoe, or was maybe being sold hard to say. There weren't sidewalks as we know them, or if they existed, they were as narrow as a worker's paycheck and just as uneven. Try stepping onto one. Sorry, there's a potato vendor taking up space, a drunk old man reminiscing about his youth, and a dog asleep on a pile of firewood. You decide to walk on the street. Worse, the road was always wet, not because of rain, but because people upstairs dumped chamber pots out the window. Yes, really. Horses left gifts wherever they pleased, and because the drainage system was an open trench running down the middle of the road, carrying everything you wish you couldn't imagine. Every time you tried to cross the street, you had to jump over the trench, dodge a horse carriage, squeeze past street vendors, duck a couple arguing loudly, and pray no one slipped into you from behind. A loud, "Get out of the way," rings out. Not because you did anything wrong, just a driver expressing himself. You turn around to see a cart speeding toward you. You leap left just as a child kicks you to the right. You fall. But luckily you land in a pile of horse manure so soft. And yes, horse carriage wheels were nearly the size of your body. And they didn't stop because brakes didn't exist. Just the driver yelling, "Whoa," and hoping the horse understood human panic in the middle of a screaming crowd. Worst scenario, rain. Because when it rained, everything turned to mud, but not poetic countryside mud. This was mud mixed with urine, horse manure, trash, and unrealized dreams. You take one step, and your shoe sinks like it's in a trap. Another step, your shoe's gone. Go back to retrieve it, high risk, because at any moment you could be hit by a cart, get trampled, or take a horsetail to the face. The elderly. They didn't cross the street. They accepted their fate. They lived on this side, died on this side. Children hired as crossing guides essentially lived traffic bait. Going to the market, you had to cross at least 3 streets, climb over 2 garbage carts, 1 dead rat, and a guy trying to sell you a rusty spoon for a month's wages. How did you get to work on foot if you were poor? If you were slightly better off, by horse-drawn double-decker bus. Sounds romantic, it wasn't. You'd climb to the 2nd level, no roof. If it rained, you got soaked. If it was sunny, you burned. The bus stopped every time the horse got tired. Horses got tired very often. When that happened, you got off and pushed. Sometimes there were accidents. People fell off the 2nd level. No one screamed. Everyone was too busy trying to stay balanced on a swaying cart like a coracle in an ocean of sludge. And if you ask, where were the traffic police? Well, they existed. But mostly to blow whistles when people fought not to regulate anything. Traffic lights didn't appear until 1868 and exploded after a few weeks. End of trial run. And now you're sitting there in the 21st century. You cross a street with painted lines, red lights, Google Maps, Uber Grab, and if you're lucky, air conditioning. You walk across the road and don't have to worry about horse dung flying into your shoes. A magnificent achievement of humankind. Had you been born in Victorian London, congratulations. You wouldn't be literate. And unless your family was wealthy, chances are you'd never be. School, sure. But picture a storage shed called a charity school, which mostly existed to keep kids from bothering adults in the streets. If you were a poor child, you didn't go to school. You worked. At age 6, sometimes 5, education meant being able to count well enough not to be cheated out of your wages, reading well enough not to grab a sign that said, "Danger explosives." And if you were lucky enough to attend school condolences. Public schools back then were cold as the landlord's heart, cramped like a tenement, and silent except for the sound of leather straps slapping the hands of kids who got math problems wrong. You sat on benches harder than your landlord's conscience wrote, with quills dipped in ink made of ash water and judgment. If you wrote badly, stand in the corner. If you spilled ink, clean the whole classroom. And if you thought you'd learn about freedom, critical thinking, or creativity, no. You learned perfect penmanship, multiplication tables. And yes, dear landlord, I will pay the rent on time. Teachers, some were deeply devoted. Others preferred rulers over words. The curriculum could be summarized as shout loud, teach fast, punish hard. And don't forget to remind the kids, If you're poor, study to obey. If you're rich, study to lead. Exams, no multiple choice. Only ruler slaps. Get one answer wrong, one slap. Get them all wrong. Sorry, today's lesson is practical endurance. If you were a girl, you had extra lessons in domestic arts, sewing, embroidery, and learning to endure the fate of mothering 12 children. Whenever a girl said, "I want to be a doctor," the usual response was, "Oh no, dear, you'll become a doctor's wife." And if you were a child with a disability, an orphan, or intellectually impaired, education would gently say, "Thank you, but we have no place for you." Textbooks limited. Mostly the Bible, a few volumes of elementary arithmetic, and the book How Good Children Behave, which taught that talking in class led to moral decay and blinded the eyes of angelic doves. Of course, there were exceptions. A few charity schools held night classes. Students would work 12 hours during the day, then sit under a dim oil lamp at night, learning their letters with blistered hands and growling stomachs. Scholarships, they existed, but usually for those with exceptional ability, meaning kids who could do mental math while dodging flying rulers. And once you finished grade 4, that was it. You entered the world armed with a notebook, a shaky signature, and a very high likelihood of working for someone who never had to learn to write their own name. You think children back then must have been tougher? No. They were tough because they were forced to be. Because if you couldn't survive the lesson, how to be an adult in a 7-year-old's body, you'd be replaced quickly and no one would remember. Now you're here, once sat in classrooms with soft chairs, projectors, teachers who didn't carry whips, and homework that just made you annoyed not skip dinner. You once thought school is boring, but now you know boring is never worse than sitting in a freezing classroom writing with a bloody hand and getting beaten for misspelling your own name. You're living in London, 1850. You're hungry. You see an apple fall off a cart. You bend down to pick it up. Thud, a hand grabs your collar. A shout rings out, "Thief, get him, congratulations." You've just entered the British Empire's justice system. And no, it's nothing like in the movies, except that it is dramatic, full of shady characters, and always ends badly for the poor. Courts. Oh yes, plenty. One for the rich, one for the poor, and one for those who can't afford a lawyer, which was most people. Trials were often held in damp rooms, with a crooked portrait of the Queen, a judge wearing a wig like a luxury mop, and a packed crowd watching like it was the weekend's top entertainment. Think you'll get to defend yourself? Oh, you have the right to remain silent, mostly because you're not allowed to speak. If lucky, you're assigned a trainee lawyer, someone flipping through a law book while whispering, "Did you eat the apple?" Yes. Oh no. But if you were wealthy or noble, it didn't matter. You never went to jail. Same crime, you get a warning. The poor get 10 years of hard labor. Justice in this era wasn't blindfolded. It saw very clearly and always punished those without shoes. Punishments were varied, creative, and often wildly disproportionate. Let's take a roll call. Stealing bread, 7 years transportation to Australia. Selling pirated books, 3 years forced labor. Failing to pay debts. Thrown into a debtor's prison where you'd live with others equally broke and wait for a financial miracle. Murder. Depends on who you killed. If it was a rich person, execution. If it was your wife, maybe just 18 months. Being a single mother. Not a crime, but seen as disgraceful, so you might end up in a moral reform institution. Children, if over 7 years old, considered criminally responsible. Meaning petty theft equals 3 years forced labor. Breaking a window equals hanging a real case it happened. Lying to a teacher equals not a legal punishment, but you'd be flagged as likely future criminal. Capital punishment was still common. Some years, over 200 offenses could result in hanging, including forging postage stamps, stealing chickens, misspelling a word on a contract. And yes, suspicious walking after 10 p.m. Executions weren't hidden. They were public events. People brought the whole family along with sandwiches and blankets like a picnic. Children were hoisted onto parents' shoulders to get a better view. A perfect first lesson in life. Son, if you take the spoon, you'll end up like that man on the scaffold. Of course, not everyone was punished immediately. Victorian police were few, slow, and often unavailable. They were busy handwriting 20-page reports describing a suspicious man in a worn coat walking against the wind. And there was a curious phenomenon. Female criminals were often given lighter sentences if they cried at the right moment. Crying in court, collapsing into a chair, speaking of an imaginary sick child might move the judge. But don't overdo it. If caught lying, you'd be given an extra charge wasting the court's time. And now you're in a society with free legal aid. Public trials, and no one gets executed for stealing chickens, and where you don't need a powdered wig to speak in court. You once thought law is so complicated. But now you know complicated is far better than being deported to Australia for eating grapes at the market. Wonderful. You've survived Victorian law, now it's time to explore a realm just as murky, chaotic, and full of wigs as a theater troupe 19th century British politics. Don't worry, he'll tell it slowly with a soothing voice, a touch of humor, a bit of satire, and gentle pacing. So you'll nod off, but still remember. So that's how they used to run a country. Victorian politics didn't resemble a system. It resembled a tea party where all the guests had knives hidden in their coats. Imagine a large, solemn room with polished wooden benches, the Queen's portrait hanging high, and about 80 gentlemen in black suits, white wigs, shouting in each other's faces. Welcome to the British Parliament. Here politics was a vaguely ruled sport where the rich discussed the poor, nobles decided whether workers deserved Sundays off, and whoever yelled the loudest usually won. Sounds like a talk show, not quite. Talk shows have commercials. This had none, just aristocratic levels of irritation. Queen Victoria, who reigned from 1837 to 1901, was a towering symbol of power, but not exactly powerful. She didn't make laws, didn't control the budget, and barely intervened in public policy. Instead, she wrote a lot of letters. To the Prime Minister, to ministers, to her pet dog possibly, and mostly to say things like, "I didn't like the way he looked at me yesterday." Real power lay where the British Parliament split into two branches, the House of Commons, where the shouting happened, the House of Lords, where old aristocrats nodded off like carved wooden dolls, but still had veto power. You imagine politicians being close to the people, not here. To be elected to Parliament, you had to be male, own property, and not be an actor, a prisoner, or someone employed in a gambling house. So if you were clever but poor, you could cheer from outside. But if you were rich and dozed off mid-session, you could head a government department. There were two major parties. Tory, later the Conservative Party, fond of tradition land, and the phrase, "everything should stay exactly as it is, including the weather." Whig, later the Liberal Party, liked reform, but not too fast, lest one's hat fall off. Their debates sounded like one side wanted bread baked for 10 minutes. The other said, "Let's try 9.5. Then they argued about it for 6 years. And the people couldn't vote. At least not women, the poor, or anyone without land. In 1832, a Reform Act was passed expanding voting rights to a slightly less poor group of men. And well into the end of the century, women were still considered too emotional to vote, but apparently calm enough to raise 6 children and sew under a leaking roof. Politicians of the time were famous for oratory, quoting Latin poetry, and the ability to speak for 3 hours without blinking or answering the question. Occasionally they debated grain taxes, whether children should be banned from working in mines, and the matter of why the poor didn't save more, even though they were eating porridge made with rainwater. Still, real reforms did happen. Some fought for limits on working hours, women's rights, and ending the death penalty for misspelling an invoice. These people were often labeled radicals, dreamers, or dangerous. Some were removed from Parliament. Others became Prime Minister. Because in Britain, anything is possible as long as you can insult someone politely enough. And now you live in a world where you can vote. There are female politicians, and you can yell at your MP on social media without getting hanged. You once thought politics is boring, but now you know old politics were boring, unjust, and wore wigs and still called it civilization. You need to buy food. No supermarket, no delivery app, no 15% off with code Victoria15. Only open-air markets. And they didn't resemble marketplaces, they felt like a vegetable war zone. You step into the market. The first thing that hits you is the smell fish, but not fresh. Meat, but of unknown origin. And an indescribable fusion of sweat-smoked gin and improperly handled baby diapers. Welcome to the Roman Forum Victorian edition. Vendors weren't shopkeepers, they were apron-wearing gladiators. Whoever shouted louder, won. Fresh carrots, 2 bunches a penny. Fresh since the day before yesterday, herring. The eyes still stare. Don't ask about the smell. Don't haggle, they look at you like an alien. Haggle too low. They curse you 3 generations of indigestion. Money still around, but not abundant. Many deals were still done by barter. A pair of holy socks for half an onion. An old dress for 2 apples and a half-hearted blessing. And if you had actual money, be careful, pickpocketing in the market was a deeply respected cultural tradition. Not out of malice, but because surviving in expensive London was a side hustle. Need meat? There was meat. But don't ask too many questions, because sometimes beef was horse, horse was dog, and dog was just meat. The butcher grins fresh. The cart only crashed this morning. You're not sure if that's a verb or a fact. Vegetables, yes, but not like the ones on Pinterest. Carrots twisted like the love life of the vendor. Turnips the size of your kneecap. And lettuce. Well, lettuce that once lived a better life before being stepped on 3 times. Vegetable sellers were usually women. Tough, fast-talking, and capable of verbally out-wrestling a guardsman and winning. If you haggled poorly, they might gift you an onion flying straight at your head. Need clothes, there's second-hand. But second-hand here meant passed through 3 owners, patched 9 times, and possibly stained with a history you'd rather not know. There were also street vendors, a man selling cough syrup made from alcohol and hope. A woman offering hair growth tonic that she herself didn't use. A boy waving a newspaper shouting, "Robbery death scandal, 1 penny for a full day of drama." Sometimes there was a black market where stolen goods, expired items, or pre-used dentures were sold. Who bought them? People in need of teeth, not questions. The market was also the town square of gossip. Who married whom? Who got arrested for stealing fish? Who just returned from Australia and brought chocolate ooh la la? And yes, there were night markets, but you only went there if you were desperate. You had insomnia. Or your friend, the petty thief, needed to clear inventory. Night markets had oil lamps, whispered deals, and sometimes screams no one investigated. You used to think markets today are crowded. But now you know Victorian markets weren't just crowded. They were dangerous, chaotic, and a place where you could buy everything except trust. Now you lie there in a room with Wi-Fi, ordering through an app clean vegetables washed 3 times delivered to your door. And you think, I forgot to buy milk today. But instead of screaming in the rain and dodging horse carts, you just open your phone. That's a miracle. And it doesn't smell like herring. Yes, the Victorian era was the golden age of churches and inner guilt. People feared hell more than tuberculosis. The common greeting wasn't, "Good morning," but "Have you prayed today?" Christianity was the dominant religion, especially Anglicanism, the Church of England, a version of Catholicism, but diluted with British aristocratic flair, less pope, more afternoon tea. The church was where you got baptized, got married, got buried, and sometimes got scolded directly during Sunday sermons for daring to buy fish on a holy day. There were two types of clergy: the gentle, soft-spoken kind who preached like a lullaby, and the thunder-voiced kind with ever-moist eyes because God is watching you. The middle class practiced religion properly. They attended service regularly, read the Bible aloud in the parlor, and always reminded their children, God loves you, but will punish you if you spill the tea. The poor believed in God more practically. They prayed daily, not for a fancy heaven, just for another breath and a crust of bread tomorrow. You ask, were there atheists? Yes, they existed, but quietly. Because if you declared, I don't believe in God, then the neighbors stopped lending you salt. Your landlord raised the rent, and you'd be invited for conversion tea with 3 clergymen in black. Beyond Anglicanism, there were also Roman Catholics, long suspected of being undercover agents for the Pope. Methodists sang hymns like they were on stage. Puritans disliked everything, including joy itself. This era also saw an explosion of evangelical movements. Missionaries traveled far and wide armed with Bibles, biscuits, and blazing eyes. They held open-air revivals where more people coughed than converted, but it still counted as a win if someone cried. Religion wasn't confined to church. It was present in schools, in libraries, in literature, in how you chose your dinner chair. Sitting in the wrong one could be seen as defying the divine order established by the Lord. People of the time believed in morality, feared sin, and sometimes got quite creative with what counted as sin. For example, laughing loudly in public, possibly indecent. Women reading romantic novels, a slippery slope to moral decay. Men shaving too closely, disrespecting the image God gave you. However, religion wasn't just about control. It was also where the poor found community, the sick found comfort, and the lost found a chance to begin again. Many churches offered free literacy classes, charity dining halls, shelters for single mothers, and some clergymen were truly as gentle as pudding, speaking softly like afternoon tea in a light drizzle. At the same time, the Victorian era was when faith began to face serious challenges. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution was like a kick to the head for those convinced humanity came straight from dust. Some were outraged. You dare say I'm related to a monkey, Owen? Not directly, just a common ancestor. The church logs off cuts contact. But like every era, belief endured, evolving, adapting and taking root in every misty street corner. Some went to church to pray. Some went because they fancied the girl in the choir. Some just went to stay warm, and that was fine too. You used to think religion today is so complicated, but now you know. Back then, religion wasn't just faith. It was a schedule, a rule book, a spiritual operating system, and sometimes the reason you weren't allowed to dance the waltz. Lovely. Now pull the blanket up a little higher, because we're about to enter a world where love, honor, and your father's property all swirl together in a most tangled waltz Victorian marriage. Still in the familiar tone, soothing like a breeze through curtains, gently satirical like pastry crumbs falling on silk. Just enough to make you smile and nod off during a wedding full of cold dishes. Victorian marriage wasn't simply about love. It was a social transaction, a financial contract, and sometimes a political chess match dressed in white and scented with bridal flowers. If you imagine a couple meeting in a park, falling in love through a glance, and marrying for true affection, that's Jane Austen's novel. Reality was a bit different. Let's begin with a small fact. Women couldn't own property, which meant you inherit a house after marriage, your husband owns it. You have savings after marriage, your husband manages them. You own a stamp collection. If your husband likes it, it's his now. Marriage was like handing over all your personal documents in exchange for someone else's last name and laundry duty. For the upper-class marriage was a puzzle of property alliances. Lord, as son marries landowner B's daughter, forming a real estate union, strong enough to fend off family C whose grandfather once went bankrupt from horse racing. Love had existed, but came after social position dowries and the color of the tea set at the engagement party. For the middle-class marriage was a dream of upward mobility. A diligent girl, moral skilled at embroidery, and quiet at the right moments, could marry a man with his own shop. And for middle-class men, a good wife had to know how to manage household expenses, not laugh loudly in public, and be ready to greet her husband's clients with, "Yes, the weather is quite pleasant today, sir," even if there was a snowstorm. What about the poor? They married for love. Or because of a baby. Or because the neighbors pressured them too much. Their weddings were simple, a vow, a loaf of bread, and a priest waiting for lunch. There were no wedding rings, only calloused hands, a small promise, and hope to last longer than last winter. For women, marriage was the biggest and riskiest turning point. You went from a girl with a name and relative freedom to Mrs. Someone not allowed to go out without permission and at risk of being sent to rest in the countryside if considered too talkative at dinner. Divorce. As difficult as finding clean vegetables in Camden Market in winter. To divorce you needed money, proof of adultery and cruelty, a husband who couldn't afford a better lawyer than you. Otherwise, you could only separate, which meant living apart, not speaking, and still doing his laundry on holidays. Pregnant before marriage, society would almost disconnect you. You'd be avoided eye contact, denied work, and sometimes sent away into hiding for years and returned as if you just explored Antarctica. Children born out of wedlock were labeled illegitimate as if they were contraband goods, and yet true love still existed. Some couples loved each other through glances, stolen in church handwritten notes hidden under pillows. Quiet looks while gathering firewood in the misty dawn. They didn't say much. They didn't embrace in public. But they waited for each other to come home, shared the last loaf at day's end, and quietly held hands when the lights were out. You think marriage today is so complicated. But now you know. In the past, it was even more so, with less freedom, more rules. And if you were lucky, still, a final refuge in a cold world. And you lying there listening to the steady rhythm of this tale, like the heartbeat of a warm wedding. Think of those who once lived, once loved, once hoped. Even in poverty, dampness, and judgment, they still married, raised children, and wished that tomorrow would be better than today. Lovely. Now lean back a little deeper, because we're about to enter a special chapter of Victorian life where newborn cries echoed through damp rooms, and parenting was a long journey of love, hunger, and patience, forged by sleep deprivation. Take a deep breath. You're about to hear about how to raise children in the Victorian era, where parents had no Google, no disposable diapers, and no one asked, "Is the baby starting solids the Japanese way or traditional style you've just given birth?" Congratulations, but don't throw a party just yet. If you're a poor mother living in East London, your birthing bed might be a tattered mat. Your midwife a neighbor who once helped deliver chickens, and your anesthetic a piece of wood to bite on, so you don't scream. Afterward, you wrap the baby in an old cloth, not to keep warm, but to keep its bones straight, because people believed babies would grow crooked legs like carrots if not tied properly. Victorian parents loved their children, but that love wasn't always gentle. Because in this era, children were seen as unfinished adults who needed molding the moment they could sit up. Baby cries. Give herbal tea mixed with alcohol. Want sleep, threaten with the blacksmith man coming to take them. Smiles too much, worry they're possessed by a spirit. Yes, even joy was suspicious, especially if you lived in a home of 7 people. 1 bed, 0 hope, and 3 rats. If you were middle class, parenting was a task assigned to someone else. You gave birth, rested a few days, laced up your corset again, handed the baby to a nanny. The nanny might be a sweet woman with a gift for fairy tales, or a thunderstorm of a woman with a voice like a trumpet and hands like wire brushes. Children in middle-class homes often didn't see their parents much, except on Sundays or when a photographer visited. What about poor children? They didn't have childhood as you know it. No time for play. No toys except a rock that could roll. By age 5, children started to wash clothes, watch younger siblings, sell vegetables at the market. If you lived near the docks, your child might be scooping coal dust from ships with blue-tinged hands and the hope of selling it for a penny to buy watery porridge. Education, not mandatory. Children got to learn if their parents had money, or if a church offered charity classes. Otherwise, life was the school. Lesson 1. Don't trust strangers. Lesson 2. Don't drop today's only piece of bread. Discipline, yes, and very strict. Forget to greet an adult, stand in the corner, or worse, eat plain rice without salt. Lie mouth washed with soap. Break a dish. Possibly spanked with a wooden spoon. Corporal punishment wasn't banned. It was considered a virtue, as if each smack expelled a little demon. But within all that harshness, there were still moments of tenderness. A poor mother darning her child's socks by weak candlelight. A coughing father carrying his child to the factory just so they wouldn't stay home alone with the neighbors or the rats. They didn't post statuses, didn't upload baby photos, didn't throw birthday parties. They simply lived and tried to keep their child alive. One more day, one more week, one more winter. You think parenting today is so stressful. But now you know. Back then the pressure wasn't choosing a school or buying a stroller. It was figuring out how to raise a child to age 10. In Victorian times, 1 in 3 children didn't survive past age 5. Every fever was a fear. Every cough was a prayer. And if your child made it through the winter, that was a miracle. And you lying there listening to the warm voice echoing through the night mist may begin to feel, no matter how times change, a parent's love for their child remains a quiet flame stubbornly burning through poverty, defying the ages and enduring even the absence of formula milk. Lovely. Pull the blanket a little closer, relax your shoulders, and let me guide you into a world both silent and exhausting, the life of the nursery maid caring for wealthy babies in Victorian times. There were no spotlights, no recognition, only the cries of infants in the night, quiet footsteps on creaking stairs, and sleep traded for nameless devotion. In the large houses with many floors, many rules, and many kinds of cutlery, parenting wasn't called raising children, it was delegating child-rearing. The lady of the house gives birth. Wonderful, now hand the baby over to the nurse. The nurse or nanny was the first to hear the baby cry, the last to wipe away the mess, and often the one the child remembered more than the parents. And if you think this job was spending the day playing with a baby, then allow me to walk you through the schedule. A typical day. 5:30 a.m. Wake before the rooster, tidy up the nappies left out overnight. 600. Feed the baby milk if any cow's milk milked the night before, reboiled twice for luck. 700. Prepare warm water and gently wash the baby. Take care not to soil the mistress's silk shawl. 800. Carry the baby downstairs for a few minutes of family time. Stand quietly beside them, not allowed to cough. 8:30. 9:00 p.m. Eat irregularly, tiptoe constantly, change nappies, sing lullabies, clean the nursery, hand wash baby clothes. Wipe the baby's nose every 30 minutes, endure teething cries, search for dropped toys under the bed. At night, sleep in a small attic room beside the nursery. If the baby cries and you don't hear it, you're at fault. If you do hear it but don't soothe immediately, still your fault. Unwritten rules. Never eat before the mistress does. Never carry the baby on the left arm, it's considered unlucky. Never speak to house guests. Unless addressed, then respond briefly with your head bowed. Never, absolutely never complain of being tired. Fatigue is a moral flaw. If the baby falls ill, you're the first to be questioned. You are a nanny, but you may also double as a seamstress for children's clothes. An emergency nurse if the baby has a fever. The scapegoat if the baby gets a mosquito bite. And a moral role model for the next generation, even though you're not allowed to raise your own child. Yes, many nannies were women who had left their own children in the countryside, entrusted to grandmothers, so they could work for wealthy families. They carried children, not their own, heard them say mama at age 3 while their own letters home were censored by the mistress of the house. And then one day, the child grows up, speaks French spells effortlessly, and no longer needs you. You move on to care for the next sibling, as if nothing had ever happened. And if you're lucky, you're given a handkerchief with your name stitched in the corner. You're mentioned in one line of the mistress's diary. Nanny Rose, quite dependable. You're allowed to sit during lunch, as long as no guests are present. What about affection? Yes, very much. Because you sleep beside the baby, hold them through their first year, wipe their first tears, hear their first laugh, teach them their first words while the parents are in the ballroom reading Byron, or dining with some count from somewhere. But then comes the time when the child goes off to boarding school or to France to learn manners, and you vanish from their memory like an old pillow once essential, now replaced. You think being a servant back then must have been tough. Now you know being a Victorian nanny wasn't just tough. It was an entire hidden life where you carried the life of a child. Yet were never called mother. And still many of them gently kissed the child's forehead before bed, whispered fairy tales, and hummed nameless lullabies learned from their own mothers. Are you still there? If your eyes are already drifting closed, let me lull you with the same melody a nanny once used to soothe a noble baby to sleep in 1872, in a house where the fireplace crackled gently and the wind slipped through chipped roof tiles. If you'd like to hear more about the dining room servants, the aristocratic chefs, or weddings among the household staff, just say, write more. I'm still here, continuing quietly, like the lives never engraved in stone yet once were the first shelter of a child. Wonderful. Now imagine yourself lying on a 4-poster bed with white lace curtains, or at least a warm blanket, because we're about to slip softly into the sparkling world of the Victorian upper class. A world where the egg spoon must differ from the soup spoon nightgowns, had festive versions, and breakfast could stretch until midday if you were rich enough to delay the sun itself. In Victorian times, being poor was miserable, but being rich, you could get away with being dreadful as long as you walked gracefully. They believed the aristocracy didn't live, they graced the room. They didn't work, they embodied tradition. They didn't worry about water bills. They had someone specifically for that. A noble morning began like this, 8:00 a.m. You're still in bed. The maid enters and gently opens the curtains so the light falls on your face at the most flattering angle. 15. A breakfast tray arrives. Black tea warm scones, rare jams imported from France, and a newspaper so you can read the latest updates about yourself. 900. Bathing begins. But not as you know it. The aristocracy bathed in perfumed goat's milk, or at the very least warm cloths. If there was a tub involved, the water had to be heated over fragrant wood, and a servant tested the temperature with their elbow. Wardrobe. There was no such thing as just throwing something on. You had morning dress, afternoon visiting attire, walking dress, tea gown, yes, that's a thing. And of course, ball gowns, evening wear, fox hunting outfits, church clothes, opera ensembles. Each outfit change was a mini fashion summit. Every gown required 2 to 3 maids to help you into, and you had to stand still like a statue because moving during corset lacing was considered shameful. Afternoon. Afternoon tea was a major event. You didn't just drink tea, you performed cultural elegance. The hand holding the cup must float as if sketching a cross in midair. Choosing the wrong tea cake could cost you your spot in the winter friendship circle. And what about the gentlemen? They didn't work either, unless it was politics, estate management, or horseback riding with exceptional flair. They might rise at 9 a.m., put on velvet trousers, polish leather boots, and read a newspaper in a personal library of over 2,000 books, though they may not have finished a single one. Sometimes they hunted, fenced, or played the cello for their soul. More often, they sat in the cigar room discussing the state of the world over brandy. Social life, overflowing with parties, balls, concerts, operas, and weekend gatherings at friends' estates. An aristocrat's social calendar could be more crowded than a president's work schedule. And you had to remember, never waltz twice with the same partner at a single ball. Never go straight to dessert at a 12-course dinner. Never bring up politics if someone named Algernon is in the room. Housing. Not a house and estate. A property larger than the village you grew up in, featuring French-style gardens, an orangery, a drawing room, a music room, a breakfast room separate from the lunchroom, and sometimes a private chapel. Naturally, the basement belonged to the servants. They lived, ate, worked, and nearly vanished from sight unless summoned by bell. Education: young ladies learned painting, embroidery, French, and how to descend stairs without making a sound. Young gentlemen learned horseback riding, dagger handling, and compulsory poetry. Academic knowledge, yes, but only enough to maintain elegance. Too much intellect was sometimes seen as slightly unbecoming for nobility. And then when the sun set, they attended evening balls, dancing beneath hundreds of candle flames in floor-length gowns. White gloves, the soft music of violins, and glances exchanged between two people who had never said more than 3 sentences to each other. Romantic, perhaps. But you didn't get to choose whom you loved. You were chosen based on land, title, lineage. You think being an aristocrat must be glamorous. But now you know. Behind every silk dress was a maid stitching the hem through the night. Behind every afternoon tea was someone polishing silver spoons since 4 a.m. And behind every smile were 12 layers of unspoken social codes you could never afford to misstep. Good. Now tuck yourself deeper beneath the covers, for this time we will not just stroll through gilded halls, but quietly sit beside a noblewoman in her loneliness, adorned with lace gilding and expertly hidden behind formal portraits. We will speak of a Victorian lady who married according to arrangement, lived in a house with 38 rooms, yet had no one who truly spoke to her. Marriage then did not begin with a glance. It began with property, titles, status, and 2 cold teacups in a carefully arranged meeting. Her parents negotiated. The solicitor smiled. She bowed as taught from childhood. To choose well is honor. To choose otherwise is disgrace. And so she married a man whose family traced back to the 13th century. He in turn married her dowry. At the wedding, she was praised as beautiful, well-mannered, a true lady. No one asked, "Are you happy? Do you love him? Has he ever looked at you long enough just to hear one imperfect sentence?" After the wedding, she was shown to her own room. No shared bed, no shared diary. Marriage was an edifice with 2 pillars standing parallel, never touching. By day, she hosted teas, managed servants, wrote thank you notes for the scented candles her aunt sent from Dorset. By night, she lay alone, listening to the wind scrape against glass panes and the pendulum clock marking every second of a life drifting gently, politely, and entirely absent. Her husband was not cruel. He was courteous, punctual, always said thank you to the help. But he also never touched her back when passing by, never asked, "What do you think about that?" and never stayed at the table after dessert. She had everything: a pearl necklace, a private drawing room, 3 different parasols for 3 kinds of rain. But no one knew who she truly was, because she had learned to smile before she learned to speak. She was taught how to walk in silk dresses, but never taught how to live in a life that didn't belong to her. And then sometimes on gray afternoons, when the tea had gone cold and the fire had died, she would open a notebook unseen by anyone. Inside were a sad poem in French, a rough sketch of a small house without servants, and the only line not meant for anyone else to read. I wish someone would ask, "Are you okay?" I wouldn't lie. Sometimes she looked out the window and saw a poor couple holding hands through the market, shielding themselves with a shared coat. And for a moment, she felt envy. Not because they were free, but because they seemed to need each other. She once tried to talk to her husband. One night she asked, "Have you ever wished life were different?" He replied as if reciting a script passed down through generations. "Everyone has their duty, and you've done yours well." Then he kissed her forehead as if sealing the final clause of a contract. She had children. 2. One lost early. The other sent to boarding school at age 7 to build character. She wrote letters weekly, not to instruct, but simply to connect. A small remnant she was allowed to love without asking permission. You think lonely and rich is still a luxury kind of lonely. But now you know. There are silk gowns that cover silent hearts. There are grand halls full of guests where the hostess longs to hide in the storage room of old magazines. And there are noble women admired by all society, yet truly seen by no one. Good. Breathe gently, because now we step across the final threshold of Victorian life, the funeral. Nothing in that era was ever just normal. Death was no exception. In the Victorian age, dying wasn't merely passing. It was a grand social event organized like a ball minus the dancing. People didn't pass away. They became eternal. And for that eternity, the family had to follow every mourning protocol, from black armbands to curtains tied at a precise 30-degree angle. When someone died, the first person you called wasn't the doctor. You called the photographer. Yes, post-mortem portraits were a real trend. It was called mourning photography. The deceased posed, upright, eyes closed, sometimes with pupils painted in, to appear lifelike. Many children had only one photo in life, and it was taken after they were gone. Preparing the funeral. You didn't call a funeral home. You called a professional undertaker, a respected trade at the time. They would measure the coffin to be 3 centimeters longer than the body for comfort. Bring in black drapes, veils for portraits, cloths to cover mirrors because it was believed that souls could get trapped in reflections. Fill the room with lilies, jasmine, white chrysanthemums, not for meaning, but to mask the scent of the body. Servants had to change into black uniforms. Decorative lace was swapped out for dark velvet. Even the clocks in the house were stopped at the exact time of death. Why? Because their time had ended. Mourning for women. Nothing was more complex than the mourning period for women. If you were the widow of the deceased, congratulations, you now had the right to wear full black for the next 2 years. It was called full mourning. Not just the dress, but also the hat, gloves, undergarments, shoes, and jewelry. All black. As dark as the mood, as heavy as the duty. After that, you transitioned to half mourning, which allowed gray and pale purple. But you still couldn't laugh out loud, couldn't attend parties, and absolutely could not appear cheerful. And men mourning was gentler. A gentleman only needed to wear a black armband, switch to a black tie, and grieve in moderation. No one expected him to close his heart for 2 winters the way his wife had to. The art of condolence letters. Writing a condolence letter in Victorian times was an art form. You couldn't scribble. You had to use black bordered stationery, black ink, and a tone as if each word were a tear. The opening line wasn't "I'm so sorry to hear." It was "Please accept my deepest sympathies in this hour of solemn and eternal remembrance." Sounds sad? Yes. That was the point, and after the burial, the story didn't end. Families might wear black for years. A widow couldn't remarry too soon, or she would be seen as disrespecting the departed. In the home, a miniature shrine might be set up, a portrait, a lock of the deceased's hair curled into a rose shape, a book of memorial poetry, and the handkerchief they once used. But here's a small truth rarely said. Not everyone was mourned. The poor, they died and were buried hastily. No flowers, no black hats, just a worn-out cloth, a shared grave, and a few quiet tears if any kin remained strong enough to stand there. You think modern funerals feel so cold? But now you know Victorian funerals could be solemn, but also heavy with obligation. Grief was not just a feeling, it was a duty, a ritual, a script one had to memorize. And after everything, when the mourners had gone, the servants had stored away the black cloth, and the house returned to silence. The ones truly grieving were still grieving. Whether in black or lilac, still at the grave or already home. Because sorrow doesn't require etiquette. It only requires a beating heart. And so after a long quiet night, wandering through the layered alleys of the Victorian age, from the cramped room of a nursery maid to the golden halls of aristocracy, from silent tears at arranged weddings to the final breath in a grand mourning ceremony, perhaps you've come to see history isn't just what's written in books. It's in the sighs swallowed into pillows, the soot marks on a servant's cuff, the hug never given between people who lived side by side, but never truly touched. And if you're still lying there under a dim golden light, your eyes growing heavy, then I just want to say, you don't have to remember everything you just heard. Just remember this: no matter how harsh the times, people always found ways to love, endure, and survive quietly, but steadfastly. I wish you a deep, restful sleep. No more knocks at midnight, no more coal smoke in the attic room, no more heavy dresses tied around aching hearts. Just you and the dream where you are free to live the life you choose. Good night. It'll still be here when you need another story on another night.